Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the results of the fall in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 3 tells us the story of the fall. We've already looked at the events leading up to the fall into sin. The serpent was introduced back in verse 1, and then he speaks to the woman. There's the temptation, and she takes from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and she eats, and she gives to her husband, and he eats. And that's the events leading up to it. Now what we're going to look at, we saw beginning verse 7, where God shows up and he asks some very pointed questions, asks the man and the woman, where are you? And then he begins to give what will be the curse against sin, first against the serpent, and now that's going to be toward the man and then finally the woman. Ultimately we'll see the coats of skin, and then at the end of the chapter they will be banished from the garden. Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now I want you to notice that this is given in Hebrew parallel. It's really poetry in action. Hebrew poetry is not where it rhymes, but it's given in stanzas where you say something in a single line, and then you might either repeat it using different words, or you might say its opposite. So what we have here is synonymous parallelism, where God says, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth, and then he says the same thing, only he uses different words. In pain you will bring forth children. In pain you will bring forth children is the same thing as I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. That's synonymous parallelism, where he says the same thing. The next line is antithetical parallelism, where it's saying really sort of two opposite things in contrast to one another. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now, what does that mean? Certainly throughout history, men have ruled over women, sometimes in a very harsh and dominating way. And yet throughout history, women have still desired husbands. And that's what's being said here. Your desire will be for your husband. You're going to want a husband, and yet he's going to rule over you. So those are actually in contrast one to another. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and following. Give a commentary, the New Testament commentary on this, where it says a woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into the transgression. And so there's a certain protocol, a certain way that Paul sees life in his day, and that's to be reflected in the church. And it goes back to both creation, the order of creation, but it also goes back to the fall. And yet, verse 15, he says, but women will be preserved, and the word preserved there, sozo is the Greek word. The woman will be saved, actually, through the bearing of children, if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. Now, what kind of preservation is that? What kind of quote-unquote salvation is that? I think the translators did well to translate it preserved, because to say it that women will be saved sounds like maybe spiritual salvation, and that's not what's being described here. In what way are women preserved? Or I'm going to go back to that actual Greek term. In what way are women saved through the bearing of children? It's not where they're saved from hellfire or anything like that, but rather from that position of submission, that position of submissiveness, that submissiveness to others. They are saved from that through the bearing of children. Because in the bearing of children, women hold a rank of leader. And they are leaders to their children, even to their male children. Everybody had a mother. And that speaks of what's happening here in this verse. Well, verse 17 now speaks to Adam. Then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. Here's the curse. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. And so the ground, which had been blessed earlier, there had been, God had looked at creation and said, it is good, it is very good. Now it is cursed because of man's sin. He's going to have to fight the ground, and toil you will eat from it all the days of your life. Verse 18, both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And so man is going to be against the ground, and the ground's going to win. And he came from the dust. That speaks of his creation back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And to dust he shall return. Warren Gage shows some examples of what he calls retributive irony. First with the serpent, who was, back in chapter 3, verse 1, more crafty than any beast of the field, and yet now is made lower than all of the other animals. Satan, although he's not mentioned here by name, I think he's here behind the scenes here in Genesis chapter 3. Satan bruises Christ on the heel, and I'm taking that from Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And yet he is bruised on the head. He wins, or it looks like he's winning, when Christ goes to the cross, and yet the cross is a defeat for Satan. The woman, as we just saw, desires her husband, and yet finds that he shall rule over her. The man is made of dust, and by eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he would rise to be like God, but instead he's going to be returned to dust again. In those typical Disney films, and I'm thinking of the one, The Lion King, that's what's pictured here. They sing the song about, you're part of a wonderful circle of life, and isn't it wonderful and yet that's very violent. The circle of life is a violent work in progress. This world operates under a curse, and it groans, according to Romans chapter 8, under that curse, waiting for its redemption. Because we live in a fallen world, and this isn't the way it ought to be. Romans chapter 8, verse 20, for the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will also be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth until now. And yet the baby's going to be born. Now the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all the Chava, the living. Her name means life or living. There's an example here, not of retributive irony, but of redemptive irony, in that the woman who was tempted to sin is now going to be the mother of all living. And in a similar way, we have the God-man, the ultimate seed of the woman, Jesus, who will die on a cross, and yet he'll do that in order to bring life to many.